For most of the Cold War, the threat of an armed conflict with the Soviets was a background concern. It was a possibility, but the idea of mutually assured destruction kept the superpowers in check. But for 2 weeks during October of 1962, war not only seemed possible, but probable. The escalation of tensions reached a fever pitch, and any one move could trigger a response that would ultimately call for the use of nuclear weapons. In this lesson, we will explore why the conflict escalated, how it was resolved, and how close we came to a direct war with the Soviets. The lessons learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis would influence Cold War relations going forward and inform the way we engage our enemies today. Up until 1959, Cuba was an important ally of the US. The US had deep economic ties with Cuba. It was a tourist destination and was home to the Guantanamo Bay Naval Base. But most Cubans lived in crushing poverty under US backed President Fulgencio Batista. A socialist revolution was underway, and in 1959, its leader, Fidel Castro, had taken power. Cuba was now a socialist country, and the US began an economic embargo against it. Castro turned to the Soviet Union for support. The US now had a communist country 90 miles off its southeast coast. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy tried to remove Castro from power. The CIA backed plan called for an invasion by Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. But the air and naval support the US promised failed to achieve its goal, and the invading forces were easily captured or killed. The invasion was a massive failure and a black eye for the new president. Cuba was now on high alert and turned to the Soviets to bolster their defenses. In 1962, the Soviets were sending defensive weapons to Cuba. But on October 14th, US spy planes took photos of medium range ballistic missiles in Cuba. These missiles were capable of carrying nuclear warheads and landing deep inside the United States. A day later, they found evidence of intermediate range ballistic missiles capable of hitting almost anywhere in the US. This was a serious escalation by the Soviets. US military advisors wanted immediate airstrikes against the missile sites, but such action would have led to retaliation by the Soviets and most likely an all out nuclear war. Kennedy asked for other options. A few days later, his advisors came up with another idea. A blockade of Cuba would prevent more missiles from coming in and buy time for a diplomatic solution. Since a blockade is an act of war, it was called a quarantine. President Kennedy went on national television to announce his course of action and threaten retaliation if any missile were launched. As Soviet ships approached the quarantine line, Kennedy gave orders to fire on them. But moments before torpedoes were fired, the ships stopped and turned around. A direct conflict with the Soviets had been averted for now. Unable to negotiate directly under these circumstances, Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev held back channel negotiations using spies and intermediaries. On October 26th, it seemed like a deal was in place. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba if the US pledged never to invade Cuba. But a day later, the Soviets reneged. President Kennedy ordered airstrikes, followed by a ground invasion for October 29th. The US attempted one more round of negotiations. The US agreed to accept the terms of the first offer and also made a promise to remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey within 6 months. The Soviets had to promise to keep this part of the deal secret. On October 28th, the Soviets agreed to the deal. This was 24 hours before airstrikes were set to begin. The tension of this conflict highlighted the need for more communication between the US and Soviets. A hotline was established to provide a direct line between Washington and Moscow. This was the closest the US and Soviets would come to direct war, and tensions would de escalate from there. In October 1962, the US and Soviets were on the brink of war. The Communist Revolution in Cuba and the failed attempt to remove Castro put Cuba on edge. The Soviet introduction of offensive missiles posed a direct threat to the US, and any direct attack on either the Soviets or the US would have led to all out war. With a quarantine, secret negotiations, and a deal between the Soviets and US, a nuclear war was averted. This would lead to an easing of tensions down the road. Although it would not happen for another 29 years, in the next module we will learn what led to the fall of the Soviet Union.